All right, we made our way down. I want us to begin on top of page 18. We have, as much as we're going to, spent time talking about the rule and the leadership capacity of Alexander, referred to as the Great. And of course, as is the case, even with those that the world classifies as great, they end up dying, lo and behold. Even though he was in many ways looked upon as being great, and of course he simply used the resources that were available to him. He made wide use of, obviously, the privileged position that he had, the skill that he possessed, the educational attainments that he had, and the influence that he exerted throughout the world to the point where obviously he was, until he was married, he was certainly one of the most eligible bachelors there was. Of course, if they'd known he wasn't going to live no longer than he did, then maybe he wouldn't have been in that position. But we're going to see something about what transpired as it relates to the children of Israel and in Palestine and all at his death. And keep in mind, too, that while we refer to what transpires around Jerusalem at the time, without a doubt, there are a whole lot more Jews scattered throughout the world than simply living there in that little spot in the Middle East, for sure. Because they were, of course, when they were given the opportunity to return to Palestine, only about 50,000 chose to do so. And there's obviously millions that are spread throughout, first the Babylonian Empire, Medo-Persian Empire, the Greek Empire. They're still spread out everywhere. And one of the things that we end up seeing that Alexander the Great did was he encouraged the Jews to live in Alexandria, of all things. As a matter of fact, he gave them tax breaks and everything else that we see that happens in our day and age, trying to build up a population of Jews in a foreign city like that, of course, which is going to be his capital, is what he's wanted it to be. And so as far as his country is concerned and his empire is concerned, and that's a place that he wants to have a bunch of Jews in. And there's a reason for that, obviously. We noted how that he treated them good. He was a very benevolent leader, as it was the case, and allowed them to engage in their religious activities as they saw fit, gave them their day off, and all that went along with that. Of course, we wish it would have been the case that those that followed him had the same attitude towards the Jews that he did, but of course they didn't. And at the top of the page here, it tells us that when he did die, that ends up his kingdom is divided amongst 4 of his generals. And if you want to see how that prophecy worked and was even fulfilled during this period of time that we refer to as being the silent years, then you go to the 11th chapter of the book of Daniel and you see it just lay it out in pretty specific detail as to what transpires, and is obvious from even the notes that we have here. Because of these 4 generals, all 4 of them were not equally powerful, for sure. As a matter of fact, there were only 2 out of the 4 that were powerful, and they're back and forth with each other and against each other as time goes on, defeating and warring and retaking lands from one another. But nonetheless, those 4 generals had their territories divided among them. And this is where we end up getting terms that you might be exposed to sometimes, but don't know where they come from, the Ptolemies as well as the Seleucid. And so there you have those 2 generals specifically mentioned here on page number 18. And when you see the Ptolemaic Empire, then you're thinking Egypt. And when you see Seleucid Empire, you're thinking Syria. And that's the only way I can keep it correct, is because Syria and Seleucid both start with an S. And so by the process of elimination, I know the other one has to refer to Egypt. That's the only connection that I can make. And of course, they end up being the most prominent. One other thing before we get too much further ahead is I want us to see a little bit about what happened before all this does happen and the dividing of these territories. And this is notes that I've taken down through the years, and it has to do with what transpired when Alexander died. And that information is not found actually in our material. But of course, he was 33 years old when he did die of a fever. Don't know what it was. Don't know if it had been closer proximity to a decent doctor like maybe Luke or something, you know. That, of course, he couldn't have been, but he had some remedy from his death. But he had a wife at that time who was with a child. And, of course, keep in mind that we're talking about a period of time in which what we would think would happen doesn't necessarily happen. Because after he left Greece and began this worldwide conquest, it's been 11 years. He comes back home and he dies, but he leaves this wife and this child. And of course, what do you think happens to the wife and child? They're killed. Okay. So, not too happy a thing to say, but you can imagine if somebody is in position of leadership and word gets out, Alexander's got a kid, we better hide him. I mean, that reminds us sort of what happened during the divided kingdom, you know, and how that they were so suspect of anybody that might vie for their position that the easiest thing to do would just knock them off and not have to worry about it from then on, of course. Well, that's obviously not the way that things should have done, but nonetheless, they did transpire like that during those days. And then with the dividing of the territory, then that is the fulfilling of Daniel chapter 11 in specific detail too. So let's look at the two different groups that are going to get our first attention, with the center of the Ptolemaic Empire in Egypt and the Seleucid Empire in Syria. And that's on page number 19. Now, some of this will just seem like just plain old history. You know why? Because it is. That's why it'll seem like that. And if you don't like history, then it's very likely you're not going to like this information. But the one thing about history is that when you look, whether it's ancient history or whether it's recent history, you're dealing with human beings who have the same types of problems regardless of what time frame they happen to fit into. You see the good, the bad, and the ugly in all of them. It doesn't matter what time frame you're talking about, you know. Even in the midst of a whole bunch of ungodliness and heathenism, there are bright spots that come up from time to time. And in the midst of what you would think would be good times and good people, then there's black spots that come to the forefront, and their influence is exerted too. So don't be surprised if any of those things happens during this period of time. And so these generals, and they're fighting amongst themselves, and of course there's numerous books that have been written concerning all these events, and of course none of them are inspired. That's the thing, you know. If we had an inspired history, then we could take it to the bank, as it were, you know. But since we don't have an inspired history, then we're dependent upon historians, and to the best of our ability, then we put together those histories and seem to at least come to some kind of guideline as to what's going on. Notice under Roman numeral number 1 with Ptolemy, and let's jump down all the way to the Jews after the death of Alexander. They had been under the rule of the Seleucids, but only for a short time. So that means that the influence out of Egypt was being felt, but now it's going to be felt more so from Ptolemy. Okay? And notice it says Ptolemy the first was not the benevolent conqueror and ruler that Alexander had been. Well, if you point out, like we did a few minutes ago, that Alexander was a benevolent conqueror, then you think about the very opposite happening. Well, that's what happens during this period of time, and some of those things are mentioned here in this next reading. When he found out that the Jews observed the Sabbath, what did he do? He said, that'll be the day that I attack Jerusalem. You know, that's pretty good timing. You know, they won't be expecting that. They're on their day of rest, and so that'd be a good day for me to attack. Well, that's the very opposite of what Alexander would do. And so just because he leaves the resources in the hands of generals doesn't necessarily mean that those generals are like him at all. Some of them are the very opposite of him. And then Josephus, who is Josephus anyhow? He's a Jewish historian. And of course, as it is the case, as a Jewish historian, one of the few that's available for us to refer back to during this period of time, except to maybe balance it out with Roman historians or other historians that were contemporary with him, then what he has to say concerning these events here is, we guess, hope, is pretty accurate. So he writes, The people known as the Jews, who inhabited the most strongly fortified of the cities called by the natives Jerusalem, have a custom of abstaining from work every seventh day. On those occasions, they neither bear arms, nor take any agricultural operation in hand, nor engage in any forms of public service, but pray with outstretched hands in the temple until the evening. Consequently, because the inhabitants, instead of protecting their city, persevered to their folly, Ptolemy, son of Lagus, was allowed to enter with his army, and the country was thus given over to a cruel master, and the defeat of a practice enjoyed by law was exposed. In other words, they shouldn't have had any such law as that, because if they didn't have that Sabbath law, then they would have been able to protect themselves. So it was really their fault, you see. Or here's someone who's out for no good, who's taking advantage of a dedicated, faithful service by doing what he did on a day in which they could not defend themselves. You know, how you want to look at it? Well, it's according to where you want to be a good guy or a bad guy, or pull for the rotten person or pull for the faithful, and obviously we ought to pull for the faithful. That experience had taught the whole world except that nation the lesson not to resort to dreams and traditional fancies about the law until its difficulties are such as to baffle human reason. Now, what has that got to do with anything? Should they have been expecting the possibility of being attacked by an army? Well, sure. But here's the thing. When you're given a task of self-preservation, as it were, you know, do you keep on doing things as normal, especially when they are prescribed? I mean, just think about the recent happenings in Texas that's got our attention over the last few days, you know. It was brethren that were assembled up in outside of Nashville here not too long ago. You know, they had some crazy guy that went in there with a gun, and it just so happened that one of the young men had a gun in his vehicle, and he went out and came back in and ended up stopping a whole lot of people from getting killed on that occasion, you know. Well, so what are we to do in a world in which things like that can happen? Do we just quit worshiping? Do we quit announcing our times because it's too easy for people to say, hey, they're going to be there at 10 o'clock, and so if we get there about 5 after 10, then very likely we'll get in like we're visitors and we'll take advantage of them. Can people do that? Well, sure they can. But you can't worry about that, you know. You have to be wise as serpents and harmless as, that's sort of, you know, that's an easy thing to say, but you have to prepare for some time what could possibly happen. But you don't give up a practice that's required. Jews couldn't give up their Sabbath observance. That was a part of who they were. That was what made them distinct. And when we lose our distinctiveness, then we lose our reason for existence. So while there are some, without a doubt, who'd say, well, if it hadn't been for this old Sabbath observance, then we'd have been all right. We wouldn't have been taken captive by this foreign power. But that's the wrong thing to say. That's the wrong way to think. To be faithful means that in spite of the fact that these circumstances beyond our control happen, the final analysis, it don't matter anyhow. We're simply doing what we're supposed to be doing, see. Now, that don't mean we don't pay attention to what's going on, but it does mean that we have our priorities in order as it relates to what our responsibilities really are. And to classify what they were doing in observing the Sabbath day, keeping it holy, as some type of fanciful tradition that had been passed down is just exactly the way that people think today about almost every aspect of Christianity. You know, it's some man-made fanciful thing that's been passed down from generation to generation, failing to realize that it comes from heaven above, see? So, and while the world may not understand that, they never have, you know, understood the things of God. It's not because it's not understandable, it's because they have their mind and attitude somewhere else other than that. And so even from examples like this, we can see, you know, at least a point or two that will help us, hopefully, to deal with the situations that happen even in our day and age. And, of course, one of the things, and I don't know if you've ever put yourself in a position as being a world conqueror or not, would you name places after yourself, you know? Well, it doesn't happen. Amazing thing done through history is that we see there's a lot of cities that have been named a whole bunch of different things down through the years, because whenever somebody comes in and takes it, then they change the name. And so it's no longer known as that previous name, except to those who lived during that period of time before they were defeated. And now another name is there. I mean, you see that, of course, throughout the former Soviet Union and also in the world in general. And that was a practice that they had involved in doing here too. And notice letter D, he set about to make Alexandria a key and great city. And notice 100,000 Jews were repopulated there. That's a large group of Jews going to a foreign place such as that in order to set up shop. But not just to go there and like as the children of Israel went, the descendants of Jacob went to Egypt, and were given the prime place there to take care of the herds and all, the primest real estate available in Egypt when they came in the land of Goshen. But they were incorporated in the daily affairs even of the country. So much so that even, notice it says that there were 3,000 Jews that were put into the army, and it says this was in fulfillment of what was prophesied by Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 19, verse 18, 19. Somebody read that passage of Scripture if you've got a Bible handy.
In that day 5 cities in the land of Egypt will speak the language of Canaan and swear by the Lord of hosts. One will be called the city of destruction. In that day there will be an altar to the Lord in the midst of the land of Egypt, and a pillar to the Lord at its border.
Now, we're not talking about a idea that somebody once had, and it sounded good and it was obscure, and then maybe down through time that you could find maybe a little point here. No, this is specific, pre-written history is what's going on here, Specific in that we have God who's predicting, which is not prediction in the sense that man is involved in it, but simply stating beforehand what's going to take place. And obviously it does. When you've got such as this fulfilled, then once again we see the hand of God is in the midst of all this, even though if you're one of these individuals who ends up going to Alexandria at the time, you may not understand how you're figuring into God's plan in that situation, but in reality you end up being a part of that which fulfills this promise that was made all the way back in the days of Isaiah 700 BC. And that's significant. It's going to be significant not just from the standpoint of fulfilling prophecy, but it's going to be significant in that here's preparing the way for the Lord, in essence, by preparing for the means whereby the gospel is going to go to the whole world. And here's foundation being laid all the way back this far in advance to see to it that a more successful opportunity will be available there, for sure.
Before you get too far gone, that point you was making about Jerusalem being taken by Ptolemy and everything.
Yeah.
It seems to me that the Jews had made up so many regulations as it related to the Sabbath that God didn't make. Even Jesus talked to them about it. That they had to know the army was coming.
Surely.
I mean, the fact that they allowed the Sabbath to interfere with their own protection, I don't know that was something that God would have wanted.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's one of those situations in which you've got a choice, but it's not a choice between a right and a wrong. It's a choice between two rights, Or is it right for us to remember Sabbath day to keep it holy? Yes. Is it right to preserve your own life so that you can keep on remember the Sabbath day to keep? Yes, that's right too. So if you have the opportunity to defend yourself, so that you might continue to influence those that come after you to remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, then by all means, by way of self-preservation, defend yourself. And of course, that's one of the things that concerning the whole Holocaust. And while there, of course, we're not talking about across the board lack of defending themselves, but it was so obvious that people were just marching to their death without so much as a peep. You know, it's almost as if they acted like it was supposed to be that way, you know, and allowed it to happen. Just mind-boggling to me. Of course, it's so horrible it's hard to even visualize anything like that happening, maybe denying that it's actually happening. But then when you realize that everybody that you came there with is gone and you can't find them anywhere, and it sure does smell strange coming out of that big old pipe up there that's smoking all the time, you know, terrible, terrible situation. And that's a good point, Ricky, because taking advantage of their faithfulness to the point where their misunderstanding relative to the Sabbath and what was involved in it as well, did it forbid all work? Well, what about if your ox was in a ditch on the Sabbath day? Poor thing just got to lay there till the next day, you know? No. What if some other, like if a person was healed on the Sabbath day and they just crucified Jesus for the very idea that you would actually do good to help a person on the Sabbath day? That's work, man. That's doctor work. Even if you're doing it miraculously, that's working, you know. Well, they misunderstood the whole purpose for the Sabbath anyhow, and so while some would have obviously taken it as an excuse to, it's like, you know, any of those examples back, remember in the book of Proverbs, where here's a person that says, well, I can't go to work today because there might be a line out in the street. If you don't want to go to work, then go ahead and say, I'm lazy and I don't want to go to work today. Don't say there might be a line out in the street. Don't say, well, it might come up a thunderstorm and there might be some lightning, it might strike me, so for self-preservation, I'm just going to stay here at the house all day. Just tell the truth, you know. Don't use that as an escape from a responsibility. And yet sometimes, you know, remember in 2 John 9, I heard a poor lady one time, whosoever transgresseth, abideth not doth Christ, hath not God. He that abideth and doth Christ hath both the Father and the Son. If any come to you and bring not this doctrine, receive him not into your house, neither bid him Godspeed. For he that biddeth Godspeed is partaker of his evil deeds. And so this person said, I will not even allow Jehovah's Witness to stand on my porch more than a few minutes before I can shoo them off, you know. And they took that passage to mean you cannot even have any conversation with this Jehovah's Witness or this Mormon or whoever happens to be on your front porch, you know. Of course, the principle would go to any false teacher, even false brethren. But is the idea, if they're thirsty, not even give them a glass of water? Is that the idea? Or is it don't aid and abet somebody in promoting their false doctrine? Does it mean you can't invite them in and try to teach them better? You know? I know I've heard people take the position, you know, as long as I've got them in my house and I'm trying to teach them, I know they're not deceiving somebody that's going down, that lives next door to me down the road, you know, as long as I'm trying to teach them there. So, but that was an excuse, really, to not have to know anything about what they taught by just saying, I don't live in my house. I don't even say boo to them, you know. Well, they are people that need to hear the gospel, even though they're mixed up in what they're believing and what they're trying to get you to believe. They still need to hear the gospel. So that's overstretching, in my estimation, receive him not into your house, neither bid him Godspeed. Now, if you have him to spend the night with you, and then when he leaves the next morning, you give him a big old breakfast and give him $100 to buy gas, you're aiding and abetting a false teacher. If you're sitting there with him and studying the Bible with him, trying to teach him better, you're not aiding and abetting a false teacher. You're not having fellowship with him and assisting him in that. That's a difference there.
How else do we convert the world? We're going to just leave them alone.
Exactly. Just the whole becoming a hermit and having nothing to do with the world. You can't hardly influence the world if you're not making contact with it, for sure. All right, so here was read in Isaiah chapter 19, 5 cities speaking the language of Canaan. One's going to be called destruction, which is possibly a reference to On, which was 5 miles northeast of Cairo. And it was the center of worship of the sun for those Greeks of that day. the word Heliopolis is Sun City. You thought that was Tampa Bay or somewhere down there in Florida, didn't you? In actuality, it's not there. And, and of course, the Jews built a temple there, of all things. And of course, well, we'll see this here in a few minutes. So let's go look at the second Ptolemy, also referred to as Philadelphus, and reckon why his name was that, which is sweet. His love for who? His wife, who was also his sister. Boy, you talk about brotherly love going crazy. We got it there for sure. And of course, that was something that transpired back during that period of time. Intermarriage with family members, of course, keeping it all in the family. Of course, forbidden ideas such as that, of course, incorporated into the law of Moses. But these are people who are not living under the law of Moses. And who was the last in this line of leaders of all things? Cleopatra. Cleopatra herself. And she married her brother. So you talk about keeping it all in the family, then that's what they're doing for sure. And this influence, and of course it's not that type of what we'd look upon as being somewhat immoral influence that's being felt throughout the world. It's the way of doing things and the use of the mind and drawing conclusions and all of the Greek culture is promoting that will end up being highly beneficial for people who have not ever actually used their intellect before. You know, they've just sort of followed along, followed the leader, and hadn't ever even questioned who the leader was. They just sort of went along and didn't rock the boat. But the time's going to come when, and of course it should have been that way all along. You know, you didn't just accept something because somebody said it. You accept it because it was true, and it was provably true. And so that type of mentality has to evolve into thinking of people. And then here's a lighthouse that's built. And of course, it, along with 10,000 other things, was one of the 7 wonders of the world, you know. How many wonders of the 7 wonders of the world are there, you know? I don't know if anybody's ever counted. I remember when we first moved to Dunlap that people said that Rock City was one of the 7 wonders of the world, you know. And if it is, then Ruby Falls has to be. For sure. So we've got a bunch of those right here in close proximity to us. And then, of course, with Alexandria being the center of learning for that day as to what Athens became a little later on, as far as the influence of what all went forth from that capital city of the world at that time. And, of course, with the library there, a museum there, all of these highfalutin, sophisticated things that you would expect in a capital city. Then we have the opportunity then for a written translation of the Old Testament scriptures in the Greek language. And this even mentions a possibility as to why. Why would you need the Old Testament, which was written in Hebrew and Aramaic, why would you need that in the Greek language? What practical reason? Well, if you don't speak Hebrew, you can't read it. That sounds pretty practical to me, you know. And it's even incorporated into some of the notes here that if you were a Jew at this period of time and you could speak Hebrew, you were one of the few that could. Just tell you the truth. They didn't all have a little Old Testament in their back pocket, you know, and they walked around and read it all the time. No. They were dependent upon the priest. They were dependent upon the religious elite to keep them in contact with what God's Word was. And while, of course, it was available to anyone, it would have been real easy as you were a citizen of this country, and then it's defeated by this country, that's defeated by this country, and all these different languages come through. And so for you to be able to even go to the store and buy bread, you've got to speak everything but Hebrew. Then you get a little rusty in your Hebrew, and before you know it, you can't even read the sacred book that was given to you, because that's not the language you speak anymore, you know. what kind of pickle would we be in today if the only copies we had of the New Testament was in Greek? We'd be in a pickle, wouldn't we? We'd have to have Jim to teach a Greek class right here, you know. And it'd be a never-ending Greek class because we'd have to learn everything Jim learned, and then we'd have to go on from there and just keep on learning. It'd be a difficult thing for sure. And so what's interesting and what's oftentimes overlooked is that when Jesus and the apostles come on the scene, guess what they quote from when they quote from the Old Testament? They quote from the Septuagint, you know. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means it was a reliable translation of Scriptures. That's what it means, you know. It was translated correctly. Now that we don't, not all the way through, I mean, we can't make that call, but obviously, when it's quoted by an inspired man, then we know that the quotation from an inspired man means that the quotation from the Septuagint was right on, you know, it was accurate, and thus used by the apostles. You see, sometimes people have this idea that when an inspired document leaves the original language that it was revealed in, then it leaves its inspiration. Now, to some people, that makes sense. I never have understood that thinking, you know. I mean, most people who would say something like that, they would agree that if you said, "I love you" to your wife in Spanish, if they were a Spanish-speaking wife, then it carries with it just as much as if you were to say it in English or Swahili for that matter, you know, because you're expressing yourself in words that she understands with exactly the same words that "I love you" is in English, see? So, but that is nonetheless, that's one of the positions that people have taken in trying to remove the authority of the Scriptures and saying that it loses. And, you know, the thing is, and I don't know where they are right now, but Muslims for years said the only time that the Quran was inspired was when it was in Aramaic, you know. And so if you read an English version, then it wasn't inspired. Well, that's a pretty sorry book then, because it doesn't carry with it its inspiration except when it's in the original language. Arabic, I mean, yeah. Yes, Jim?
Freddie, you know, if you take that analogy a step further on, those who contend that the translation means that it loses inspiration because it loses its meaning and affects what they're actually saying, you can't rely on it. What if that person who makes that contention was talking to someone who didn't understand English and had to have a translator to translate what he said to this person who didn't understand English?
That's right.
If it's accurately translated, then he has communicated his message, and he wouldn't deny that he has.
Exactly.
So it's
Exactly.
inconsistent to deny, you know, the position that written translation, when it's translated, loses its inspiration.
Yeah.
Because somebody would be willing to do that, and
Well, sure.
be comfortable with doing that, and sometimes has to do.
Absolutely.
That's
Yeah.
a lot like these people used to say that it wasn't right to have the quarterly and teaching Sunday school class, but yet the man stood up there and expressed his opinion the same way.
Sure. Yeah. The no uninspired literature in Bible class position, an anti-position that there's probably still some people that have that position, you know, that you cannot use anything but the Bible in class because to use uninspired literature is to bring man's ideas into it. Of course, when a person says they don't want any man's ideas in it, they're expressing the man's ideas that they don't want man's ideas, you know. But those ideas are all right, you know. And of course, I've been in some of those classes, and you have too. And of course, the other extreme is having a class where the Bible is never even talked about, or never even mentioned, or never even referenced, and everything is nothing more than man's ideas and opinions. Well, that's obviously another ditch of extreme that should be avoided for sure. So with the Septuagint, notice number one, the writer suggests it was to provide a copy of the Jewish scriptures for the library, and it's entirely possible that it was prompted by the desire of Greek-speaking Jews to want their children to be able to read the sacred writings. Now, they could have got their own private tutors, I guess, but them private tutors would have cost them an arm and a leg probably. So the easiest thing to do is just have an Old Testament that's in the Greek language, because our kids are not learning it. They don't know Hebrew anyhow. And of course, that was a problem for the Jews from way back, where they could not understand God's will for them because they had so been influenced by the heathens amongst who they lived that they spoke the language of Ashdod, which was something other than what they were supposed to be speaking, So circumstances, I dare say, would dictate. I know there used to be a time where we had enough capable, older, well, I say older because they were, gospel preachers that if the Bible had been destroyed, then they had memorized the Bible from beginning to end, and it could be put together very quickly, just by the minds of those individuals. And this, of course, is before there's any such thing as a computer or anything else, because it so filled the minds of so many that they could have spit it out in Hebrew and Greek and Aramaic all too, because of their studious display in the Bible languages, for sure. And I never could do that, for sure. All right. I think it's this little letter in number 3 there, the letter to Aristeas, a document supposedly written about 100 BC, written to a librarian. He says that Ptolemy Philadelphus, that's the guy that loved his wife so much that they changed his name to Philadelphus, sent a request to obtain 6 elders from each tribe of Israel to do the translating of the Septuagint. Now, just with what we studied in the divided kingdom, is that even a possibility? No, it's not. Why not? Yeah. So as far as being able to get together men qualified to do that, it would have been hard, if not impossible, to round together those fellas who had been carried into Assyrian captivity all the way back in 721, 722 BC, and to never return. Now, of course, that don't mean that there were not people who were from the northern kingdom that returned to Palestine, because there were, after the 70 years of the southern kingdom's punishment, then in the groups that went back, 3 groups at a time, there are individuals who are from the northern tribes, but finding scholars amongst those, that's just, that sounds good, but it's a reality? No, I don't think so, But if you were trying to find support to suggest that this authenticates this as an accurate translation, then that would further do it with material evidence. The only problem is there ain't no material proof that that's what happened, and it doesn't take that many. I mean, how many reliable scholars in the languages are needed to come up with a reliable translation? Well, it don't take 1 million for sure, as long as they're faithful to their task, a few can do it. But the 72, we looked at that, and it took supposedly 72 days to do it. I would have certainly not wanted to been on that translate committee myself, for sure. All right, we're out of time here. We'll start quickly and get through the rest of the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, and really where the rubber meets the road, as far as I'm concerned, and many good movies could be made and haven't been, is during the Maccabean period, and Judas Maccabees, and Charlton Heston would play him, if 40 years ago he would. Now it'd be somebody else that I don't even know their names no more, But there were heroes for sure who were convinced that they were God's chosen people, and they fought like it. Thank you so much.